In this episode, we want to talk about a new form of politics. Welcome to a special episode of Radical Priorities. I'm Aidan Clark.
I'm Ben Parkins.
We want to respond to a recent interview given by Yanis Varoufakis in Qatar. The setting of his answers is pretty simple. He's repeating his techno-feudalist thesis, this thesis that the big tech companies have exited capitalism. They operate digital platforms that are akin to the tech fiefs, the medieval fiefs of the past, for which they are the landlords, in effect. And this has necessitated a new form of commercial activity, in effect, which is called rent. Funnily enough, though, for Yanis Varoufakis, this is a departure again from capitalist profit. It means that so long as we use these vital platforms, without which no part of our society any longer can function, if we don't pay the rent for being on these platforms, we get effectively kicked out. And even if we don't get kicked out, the level of control that they exercise is unbelievable. And this in and of itself necessitates a serious political response. But Yanis also says something particularly interesting that explains a little bit of the misery right now, I would say, of the global economy. And he mentions this 30% figure. He says 30% of global GDP is currently being siphoned off to pay for rents to Google, to Facebook, to YouTube, you name it, Amazon, Uber, because again, they have this grip hold on what are really vital pieces of public infrastructure for the internet, without which we cannot possibly operate or survive any longer.
Basically, the thing that's different about a techno-feudalist business versus a traditional business, right, is that in a traditional business, basically they're able to extract the surplus value of your labor, right? You produce, you get paid $15 an hour for working at Walmart, but Walmart is able to make 10, 20, whatever times your value produced, right? You sell all these things. That's the same way that they sell things. They buy them for $10, but they sell them for $5. That's how they make their money. This money is basically profit, and then, they hoard it. In a techno-feudalist business, so for example, Amazon, which has, none of the costs of a brick and mortar store and doesn't actually act as a retailer in any way, right? They're not actually buying anything. Merchants exist on their platform, right? And so what ends up happening is that they have to pay a certain percentage of their sales towards Amazon. This is the rent that we're talking about. And curiously enough, it's often around that 30% figure that now represents a percentage of global GDP. So if I want to sell you, a phone, and I use Amazon to sell the phones, not only would I have to buy it for $10 and sell it for $15, 30% of that 15 then has to be paid to Amazon. So what ends up happening is that, in fact, you actually will get charged then not only the 15, but an additional 30% on top of that. And what also happens is that the way that Walmart makes that money, again, is basically purely off of that transaction. Obviously Walmart is traded and all these things, but really at the heart of the business is this sort of fundamental, normal way that we think about a business running. But on Amazon, not only do they charge the retailers money for existing on the platform, you are making money for Amazon simply by using it. There is this idea that Yanis puts forward that you and I are not seeing the same thing when we go to Amazon. It's not like being in a Walmart where we can both walk down the crock-pot aisle and we can look and see the features and go, okay, you know what? I can kind of make some kind of decision here. I'm going to buy the one that's $30. You might buy the one that's $45 because you have a bigger family and I have a smaller family, or we have different budgets. On Amazon, you barely have to use it. They already know so much about you through cookies and tracking via the internet that if I looked up crock-pots, they would give me a different selection than they would give you. And that based on what you buy, based on, how many different places you click, do you read the reviews? How do you sort by the reviews? What review made the difference? Which one did you end up buying? Did you return it? How long did you return it? They are able to optimize that algorithm that shows you specific things. So you and I are seeing two entirely different storefronts, even if we look for the same thing. And the more they're able to optimize that, and the more they're able to hook you and personalize and keep you on Amazon, the more money they're able to make and the more efficient they are. And they have all these different benchmarks that they can signal to both retailers that, well, you should be on Amazon because look at how much more personalized and tailored and efficient it is than something like a Walmart. And then that in turn increases the stock price. So this is what's different, is that not only is the techno-feudalist business able to get this surplus value of actual labor, they're also in some ways able to actually get kind of a surplus value of leisure, of the browsing. They're able to actually make money off of you simply just looking and simply using the platform.
The paradox of these companies, though, and the paradox of the techno-feudal setup, is that they're kind of, at the same time as they're intensifying commercial activity, keeping you hooked, as you said, making you probably buy more, you're refining their algorithms. And this refinement, actually, after a certain point, is a different kind of value. In fact, Yanis Varoufakis goes so far as to say it's a different kind of capital. And what this basically means is that money is not even the interest anymore, nor is profit. In that sense, even surplus value is kind of like, well, it's kind of an artifact of an older system that techno-feudalism is currently absorbing. And what remains, or what remains emphasized by the techno-feudalists, is this new kind of value, which is the control of these platforms itself is the form of value. It almost seems to be a rejection of naive economics. But what's the paradox? Well, again, you're intensifying commercial activity. You're intensifying production, right? The production of people to bring goods to these merchants who then bring them to Amazon to sell. But you're directly attacking the capacity for the basic institutions and contracts that keep commercial activity together to function, from the banks, the private and central banks, to even something as basic as like our wage contracts. I mean, not only is the increased use of artificial intelligence rendering enormous amounts of labor inessential, but the use of these algorithms seem to make our participation in our own commercial systems irrelevant. And it begs the question about, well, what is the commercial activity that is being regulated? Clearly, the end is to simply host all commercial activity. But this in and of itself will render commercial activity unnecessary.
Well, it's interesting because I use Walmart as the example of the brick and mortar store, the traditional store. It's quite ubiquitous. But if you go to walmart.com now, if you use them as an online retailer, in many cases, they operate in the exact same way as Amazon does. If you go and look for a pair of socks, it will say sold and shipped by XYZ company that is not Walmart. They themselves have been forced into this same business model that essentially looks to undo and erase the brick and mortar.
The difference, though, between Walmart and Amazon is that Amazon controls a vital piece of this big internet infrastructure.
Right.
And so when we go back and we look at the history of these companies 20, 25 years ago, Google, YouTube, Amazon, you name it, what we see is a series of companies who were basically making, file sharing, communication, book selling in the case of Amazon, really kind of the basics that you would need to have an internet. And the internet itself was a massive kind of paradigm shift, which sort of changed, in a sense, how we ought to have done, well, again, not only commercial activity, but obviously messaging, human creativity generally, human productivity, you would think. And, when we look at this 30% number, which they get to charge, say on Amazon, and then the 30% number in terms of the bigger siphoning off of global GDP, is it any surprise that we can't afford anything? It's not about blaming the tech companies. It's about recognizing that the cost for a whole other system, not the neoliberal financialized global system, is now costing 30% of like the GDP of every country to sustain.
That's unbelievable.
Everyone's paying it out. Again, merchants, but also consumers.
Right. Well, all of that is passed on to us. I mean, this is also, we're talking about Amazon as a marketplace, sort of as a replacement for the storefront. It's also worth noting that Amazon owns, AWS, the server system, that also hosts so much of just the internet of online gaming, of other commerce. Like, they literally own the servers and the connections that make the internet work in large parts, which is what really makes Amazon a lot different from some of these other companies.
And we're not going to be able to afford this this is the crux, right? We're never going to have enough money to be able to start, because money itself, our monetary systems will start to collapse. The Walmart model, the model that you introduced us to, the kind of basic model actually of capitalism, really for hundreds of years actually, relies upon enormous amounts of debt. That's where it all begins. In order for you to have the possibility to establish production in the first place, pay your wages, begin any operation on the basis of which you can accumulate surplus value, you have to start with debt. You have to start with the surplus. That's the great paradox. Now, this requires enormous amounts of money. Capitalism requires impossible amounts of money. But more importantly, it requires money that, in a sense, isn't connected with anything yet. That's why it's debt. It's already debt. And the hope is that you balance the system out. Capitalism has never done it, but that's the holy grail, is that you get these balances. And if you do get balances, it's in the boom and bust, the context of a boom and bust cycle.
Right.
But techno-feudalism isn't this. It's invalidating the massive monetary systems that we've had up until this point. And it'll also make it, therefore, impossible for us to have the normal functioning commercial activity that you need for these platforms to make sense. They're making it impossible to have manufacturing, to reindustrialize, say, the way Trump wants to do, or the way Carney wants to do in Canada. And this is major. This means that even those people who are trying to deglobalize and re-emphasize building or manufacturing or, again, human productivity will have to do so, however, only so long as they maintain or are sort of caught up in the stranglehold of these tech companies. Therefore, a political response is completely necessary.
Well, that's the thing, is that, no matter what you try to do, no matter how radical, if it's in the context of this, you are essentially paying off these debts, Google's debts, Microsoft debts, all of these things, which we just cannot afford anymore. There is not enough money to make this work, and there's no way of balancing
You're
it.
paying off their capitalist debts so that you can make their techno-feudal dreams possible.
Yeah.
But paying for their techno-feudal dreams will cost more than the collective system of capitalist debt itself.
Well, this is the trend that we see. I mean, this is what we talk about with, AI data farms being larger than the cities they power, moving more data than the internet to make the internet better in some way. Is that the scale of these things is just so unbelievable, that it's this addiction to growth that is just totally unsustainable.
Because there's a paradox, there's an unconscious element at the heart of it. There's an active repression of the fact that they rely actually upon themselves enormous amounts of debt. But more importantly, when you look back at the history, at the social revolutions of these companies, the fact that they were installing totally new social structures. They were doing exactly what we needed to do with the internet. Absolutely. No problem with YouTube, Google, etc. There are many different versions of the internet we could have ultimately developed, even in the early 2000s. But we got a decent one. We got one that emphasized social usability, the social uses, the social revolutionary powers of the internet. But eventually, something happened. And Yanis also talks about this. He talks about 2008. And in 2008, financial capitalism reached a crisis. And in order to address this crisis, which was basically the collapse of the global economy as a result of huge amounts of fraud in the American housing market, but like a series of dominoes, it all fell over, they had to pump huge amounts of money, quantitative easing in Europe, economic stimulus in the United States and elsewhere. $60 billion from Stephen Harper's conservative government in Canada. We're talking about in the grand total, trillions of dollars were pumped in. And what this created was temporary relief, but what you also needed is what Varoufakis calls a fiscal strategy. You needed a fiscal strategy for how this money was going to be spent. You also, I would argue, you needed a mentality shift. You needed the politics that says, okay, capitalism, financial capitalism has broken down once more. It's going to happen again. And so we better spend the money differently. But this is where one of maybe the more trenchant illusions of even Varoufakis' view appears. His concept is that we could have just spent the money differently. We could have just also invested not only in tech, which was the only sector that actually received money productively and was used to build industrially. But there's this concept that Varoufakis has of increasing aggregate demand by also investing all around it, in our train systems and whatever else, our healthcare, so that you can have a coherent society that can make use of the internet. Partly because the internet only emerged once almost everything else was stabilized. Healthcare and social security and wages, among many other things. But the problem is maybe it wasn't an accident that the tech sector was the only place that was productively able to make use of money, of any of this money. Maybe there's a reason, because the internet isn't just another technology, another consumer technology, something that we can sort of integrate into society and can kind of help us do everything quicker. What if it's a change itself to the very way that we make decisions, to the very way that we organize prices, such as in markets, organize production, such as in, anything, whether it's you're selling something, whether you're doing cutting down trees and then processing them, anything you can imagine that's been held within industrial and financial society, the internet kind of can do in a different way.
Right.
You don't need buying and selling. You don't need prices and profit to send signals because you have a phone in front of you. And what we've got in the form of the data revolution, which is not a great revolution, it's kind of a counter-revolution, and the use of these algorithms and the use of AI assistants, the use of Alexa, is a conversion of this social revolution that existed in the early 2000s into an extension of the existing economics of financial capitalism.
Right. Well, because we've seen how disruptive the internet has been, but the way that we got that was through things like, for a time it was cheaper and better to use Airbnb than to book a hotel, or to use Uber rather than take a taxi. Which, totally speaks to the revolutionary potential of the internet and mobile phones and, cellular data on the go. It happened. There's no denying it. And for a time, they were amazing. I remember when Ubers were half the price that a cab was, and you knew how to look for the cab and you could track it in real time. It was all these incredible improvements. Airbnb is the same thing. It was cheaper, and it's a real house with a real fridge and a real kitchen. We realized, wow, why did we build hotels in this way? They actually make less sense than just staying in someone's home. Phenomenal, honestly incredible. I'm sorry, I know at this point we just totally treat them like leeches because of the whole enshittification protocol, but really there is a reason why people gravitated towards those. But we have now this horrible mix where now they've had to actually buckle down and start making some money. So they've raised the prices. So they've removed many of the features that were incredible.
Well, they've had to replace taxis and hotels and normal retailers, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So when they were just operating with 20% of the market, and every day they got more of it, and and weren't responsible for the entirety of society, and on top of that, hadn't necessarily installed this change to markets that you get with techno-feudalism, this exit of markets as, fantastically at least free places of trade and commerce into these techno-feudal platforms. That hadn't emerged yet, partly because it was unnecessary.
Right.
There's no reason the internet had to go techno-feudal. And this is something that Varoufakis rarely, if ever, says, that it wasn't as if it was inevitable that they were going to be in this weird position of taking over, of doing what we needed to do with the internet, doing hotels better, doing transportation better, doing even commercial activity better. Now AI is better at investing. It's better at figuring out all kinds of normal logistical problems that we passed on to human decision making. And this is more a reflection of the internet than it is of artificial intelligence. It's a reflection of all of the information on the internet, the way that communication occurs on the internet, and the way that we make decisions there, right? And how it's opened up what is possible in terms of decision making that we can make. When you look, again, the difference between the taxi, which is such an industrial world version of transportation, versus Uber. Now, did Uber have to become Uber? Did it have to become a techno-feudalist? No, because all that these companies did, they didn't create something necessarily very proprietary, very unique. They created something essential, exactly what we needed for the internet, extending the internet to transportation, extending the internet wherever you wanted it to go. Somebody comes up with the rather intuitive way of, let's just use internet for taxis. That alone would have generated Uber. It wasn't a great feat of entrepreneurship. It was a simple extension of these are basically the new pieces of public infrastructure. What hasn't emerged is a new system to coordinate this.
Right.
And that new system cannot be more economics. And here I must disagree with Varoufakis directly. This is not about raising aggregate demand, about reinstalling a form of industrial productivity, but just for the new tech world. Well, we can hire people to, do a better Uber or do a better Amazon, or we need to expand fiber optic, which is going to be absolutely essential for everyone uploading videos to YouTube constantly or to Instagram. So that's going to be a massive project that requires huge government investments and sweeping employment. I don't think this is the next step because it relies upon the very contracts that at the moment the internet has replaced,
right,
and are also being aggressively, in the worst way, replaced by the techno-feudalists.
Although there was something to the effect, was it him who said it that if you really want to make some kind of change, it was almost about going to your municipality and saying, we should have our own Airbnb.
So this is what he says in the interview in Qatar.
Yeah.
His solution, which is extremely interesting, is if you want to do something, though, right now, go to your, whatever you are, your local government, and get them to do what any of these tech companies already do, because there's nothing proprietary about it. Go start the hotel app for your municipality. Go start the transportation app for your municipality. But here's the question. One, should it be necessarily a municipal or even national affair? Should it be a state-backed affair at all? It doesn't mean it has to be a quote-unquote private affair. There's nothing that's private about the internet any more than a road is private. Whoever builds it, it's never going to be private. It's public.
Right.
And the other question is, Varoufakis wants to use this as kind of political leverage against the fact that the tech companies are making it impossible for governments to function. It's literally making it unaffordable to have government, impossible to rebalance the government balance sheets. You just will not do it if you're siphoning 30% off. It was already, let's be honest, it was already impossible in financial capitalism. It was already impossible when since the 1980s we've sold off every piece of every public asset that we have, right? It's not that the answer to selling off public assets was necessarily to keep them in the hands of government, but we were, in a sense, we were waiting for the internet. It's almost as if 500 years of capitalism has been waiting for the ultimate product, which is the internet. And in a rather stunning way, let's not forget that speculative investment, speculative capital was essential for the telecommunications infrastructure and essential for the internet. You would not have these companies or the infrastructure upon which they initially relied without basically financiers saying, okay, actually we have a lot of money. It's 2008 hasn't happened yet.
Totally.
We're going to throw it at an idea as crazy as the internet. But in a sense, they created something that rendered them inessential.
But this is essentially how all of, how society has progressed. I mean, we moved from, feudalism or mercantilism and then into, this is what happens, right? You have these new forms of economics. What's unfortunate is that basically we didn't admit that 2008 was really the end of one of those, and that techno-feudalism kind of replaced it. And now, it's like we talk about, it almost seems like culturally generations are getting smaller and smaller. Now people who were, it used to be 25 years was a generation, and then human society just accelerates so fast that then it felt like if you were born 10 years apart, you're part of a different generation. Now it almost feels like 4 years. I mean, the difference between someone who was in high school during COVID and wasn't seems totally different. Now it seems like, techno-feudalism emerged and maybe wasn't even recognized until we were in the full throes of it. And now something needs to replace it, but no one's really willing to admit that, in fact, we're not even in financial capitalism anymore.
But we're also, here's the paradox, we're not even in techno-feudalism, though. We're kind of in nothing right now. Techno-feudalism is something that has emerged out of these big digital companies to, weirdly enough, answer the missing society, the missing social revolution that didn't happen with the internet. But because they rely so heavily upon their valuations in the stock market, So their valuations within traditional, let's say, financial capitalism. Financial capitalism itself relies upon a zombification of the 2008 financial stimulus, i.e., we have had successive bouts of quantitative easing, of massive monetary printing, most of which is actually done by private finance, by the way, not by our central banks. And this has made it so that we have not only created even more debt, but that this debt has been used to concentrate the power of these digital platforms. In other words, the failure of 2008 to generate a genuine mentality shift, to use the money responsibly, resulted in using the money to concentrate the ownership of the tech companies. That's what created techno-feudalism. That's what created the monster of techno-feudalism. And now that we have some version of it, it's not creating another society. It's just creating a crazy concentration of power in which all of us will be useless to resist it because we need these platforms. It's hijacked the internet, in other words. Therefore, what is necessary is a form of politics that directly addresses how to, firstly, repoliticize the internet, secondly, to follow through on what it would mean to expand the internet. And you have to, what one should do is go, we can call them industries, industry by industry, sector by sector, service by service, process of production by process of production, and say, okay, yes, ask the stupid question, how can this be an app? Making the distinction between an app that was used 20 years ago in, the version of the internet that was extremely unique, charming, a massive communication device, much better, again, than markets or prices at communicating what was going on in reality. And if, as far as I'm concerned, the internet was a full-blown departure from economics, a full-blown departure from contracts of productivity. And again, distinguish all that from obviously the apps that we have today, which are not apps. Nobody has built something like Google in decades. Maybe Uber, maybe Airbnb, but they've been around actually for quite a while now. Nobody has recognized the public demand to continue expanding the internet. And this is the political challenge right now.
Well, and it seems like AI is only going to accelerate that because, I'll give in the early internet, one of the biggest things was obviously file sharing, right? And so once you were able to send music to someone for basically no cost, right? Which at the time, I mean, obviously there was a huge debate about piracy and all of these things, but that sort of to me represents in some ways the value contract breakdown. Is that part of why your CD or your record or even your MP3 cost money was because there was, packaging and shipping and logistics and having the store, having the Walmart to go to CDs. All of these people along the way need to in some way be compensated. Once I can send you the contents of a CD for basically nothing from the comfort of my home via the internet, all of that value is now unexplainable. Why should it cost the same as a CD would cost? Why should it cost $10? Now what AI is doing to me is almost like, well, okay, once we had the internet, once we had apps, okay, but Airbnb needs all of these servers, it has programmers, it has people who maintain it, all of these things. As AI starts to replace those jobs, as we go into the vibe coding era and we fucking replace graphic designers, which I'm not in favor of, but as that happens, now we've removed even the value contract from the thing that made traditional things cost a fraction of what they once cost. And so at a certain point, it really just replaces economics and it just totally invalidates all of these things that society was predicated on.
Well, again, and let's be as precise as possible. There are two different ways of replacing economics at the moment. There's one which AI is doing, and you're absolutely right. AI is reminding us that there's this massive social project called the internet that we're not doing. We just think of it as a giant commercial enterprise. And AI is basically doing a bunch of the jobs that human beings actually should be doing proactively, making decisions about what we want the internet to look like. And they're just turning it into this massive zombified passive affair. But the other thing, the other replacement of economics is, as you say, if you take traditional commercial activity and you don't need all those steps, of course, the monetary, as far as the cost is concerned, it disappears. But the new value that emerges out of that, we don't have an explanation for it. There's no definition for it. We haven't figured out the society that can make use of it. But it's even bigger than that. The internet changes the need itself to describe a series of operations in something like society in terms of an economic procedure. That's what it makes unnecessary. Suddenly, even if you do have a fairly standard, say, even industrial process, like lumbering, say, where you have the trees, and then you have to cut down the trees, and then you have to process the trees, and then you have to transport those and deliver them, and then make use of them in the context of construction, home building, etc. That's not going anywhere. And how does the internet do it better than a market? Well, again, a market would use prices, would use commercial activity, and in the context of capitalism, that means enormous amounts of debt. That's how we maintain wages. That's how the entire system makes sense. We pay wages. Those wages pay taxes. Those taxes become revenue for the state. The state maintains massive monetary stimulus, the money supply in a sense, or it allows the private financial system to sort of do it in effect as a sort of political compromise. And then that money goes out, is used by entrepreneurs or again financiers to invest in companies like those which lumbered, who then need to pay their wages. The problem is this cycle doesn't really work. It's a very useful story for using things like profit and commerce and debt to coordinate human activity in society, to create motivations, to create goals, to unify efforts. Sorry, the internet does all of these things and much better. You don't need the fiction of profit. You don't need even, dare I say, the fiction of price. It's not that money necessarily will go away, that's a very big question. But the internet does create an entirely different structure for how you might go about organizing something like lumber. And therefore, if you go create that lumber app, and maybe it's not an app, because an app is generally something you use on your phone, which is a piece of everything technology, which in a sense isn't very technical. Kind of a crude piece of technology if you actually think about it. Ideally, what we would do is somehow expand the internet to lumber. And one of the things that this might look like is you would have your trees. You'd have some assessment of the quality of the soil, the health of the trees, their level of maturation, when they're going to be ready to cut down, their regionality, etc. And then each of those processes, in short, that it might go through to eventually become a construction material, could be easily part of the internet. And what would make up the bulk of the information would not be prices, commercial activity, but would be information itself of an almost unmediated kind, not quite, but almost. The analog information of, well, but what kind of tree is it? And again, how close to maturity is it? And what's the distance from it to the processing plant? And it's funny that the internet will massively emphasize the environmentalism of it all, the environmental costs, the energy costs, because there'll be a very figurable piece of information.
Well, that's what will replace price. There will still be prices and there will still be these things, but the source of them will be entirely different, because we do already pay attention to that: soil quality, maturation, all of these things. But those are almost a vessel for that profit or compensation.
I would argue that price doesn't even capture those things. Price attempts to capture those things, but price relies upon something very simple. It relies upon a consumer. A consumer makes a subjective decision about what they want, just as a business does. All the prices are negotiated through the subjective preference that I exercise when I buy this or I sell that, etc. Which means that, no, the price system takes absolutely no responsibility for any of the reasons why you chose that. If we're lucky, the price system will reflect soil erosion, or it will reflect the maturity of the trees. Obviously, if the product doesn't work, it's a very questionable process of production, but go look at the unbelievably cheap products that we produce in the global order and ask yourself simply whether or not you think that we've just produced the best things that we can produce. We haven't, because the price system doesn't generate the best products. All it's trying to do is sustain commercial activity itself. Ideally, and I mean this quite literally, prices will not be essential. It will be a fiction that will be rendered unnecessary. And the task will be to design an internet that can handle extraordinary levels of information, but also participation, decision-making, right? Someone will have to make a decision about this information, whether they're in the lumber industry or not. they'll have to make as buyers or sellers or something beyond those, obviously. Coordinating production, working within a scheme of production, distributing something. What does it mean to do it without a price? What does it mean to do it without a market? It means sharing information. It means coordinating human effort, not necessarily in terms of market motivations, market goals, but in terms of an interactive engagement with the information itself as it is sustained on the internet.
Well, the other thing that's really interesting is that it also introduces a much more democratic system because it's so easy to participate on the internet. I mean, that's why it's such an incredible social tool. That's why it's exploded in the way that it is. Whereas right now, if I have something to say to Amazon or to Microsoft, these people that organize the internet, I basically have no way of doing it. There's not even a company that's big enough to do this. If Apple decided to suddenly switch internet providers from using Amazon servers to Microsoft servers, wouldn't even make a difference. And so certainly for someone like myself as an individual, it's so hard to participate in this or have any kind of agency. Whereas an internet of information, again, we were going back to the idea of municipalities or of your province or of your country. It just becomes so much easier to participate in that process in a meaningful way.
Well, the internet is information. That's kind of the point. Markets were information too. For 500 years, it was extraordinary, the information that markets produced. But mainly because the multi-generational effort of creating markets, producing markets, installing markets took hundreds of years. Our generational and probably multi-generational effort will be to create the internet that we want. That's what we have to follow through. And it's changing the texture of society. I mean, go look at buildings since Google Maps and ask yourself whether there isn't a certain process of Googleification. Why do I need analog texture in a building when I exist on the internet? This is a very bad way, I would argue, of moderating the internet. Ideally, the internet would increase the analog information in the actual world because information itself would become important. And therefore, again, whether it's a choice between that cheap chair and the chair that lasts 100 years, well, it comes down to the information. And which do you think is going to be more important to you when you're not radically emphasizing commercial activity, i.e. sacrificing the quality of the product for the sake of sustaining the fiction of commercial activity and markets themselves? Well, the moment you're not caught in that deadlock, you'll make very different decisions. The political challenge, though, right now, will not only be to go exactly into our municipalities or whatever level of government and think through the major changes, the major regulatory frameworks, literally create the technology, the internet accounts. But we're also going to have to look at other classic concepts, not just price, wages, and taxes. Let's remember, the reason why this 30% number is so difficult is because it's beyond taxation. That's one of the problems. There isn't a sort of typical, normal, good old-fashioned, state-enforced neoliberal method of taxing it. And therefore, there's a breakdown in the systems of state revenue, and there's a breakdown in the entire system, which sustains massive commercial activity. And if we don't have wages because we don't have prices, and we don't have prices because we don't have taxes, and it's all going out the window, what is going to replace it? What kinds of distinctions and definitions, what other social fictions are we going to produce to describe human creativity, human effort, human engagement and participation? This in and of itself is the challenge. Not just using the internet, but again, creating it, coming up with the political terms to explain it, coming up with the societal terms, the social terms to describe what we are as an internet society.
And this is why I think it's so important right now, is that with the AI revolution, they think that technology is going to do that. That's what they think that AI is going to do. It's going to be able to make those decisions and create those priorities and negotiate those new contracts and fictions. And it's simply not. We need to be telling it. I am not against AI in its entirety. But I don't believe in it running human society or it over-determining the way that we exist.
And it can't. Let's remember, the only reason why artificial intelligence even has this role is because it's the return of the repressed, unfinished social revolution of the early 2000s. The only reason why we feel like AI is so necessary is because everything is collapsing around us, and we desperately need a new stability. And it's too bad that our contract of stability is utterly passive. Because as you've already remarked, AI will not be able to make these decisions. AI will not be able to interact in an embodied way. Decisions have nothing to do with efficiency. Decisions have to do with interaction. It's not a choice between which is more efficient, which is a commercial paradigm. It's a choice between, well, what makes sense for here? Or how, when I take into consideration these complexities and textures of information and thoughts and ideas, what kind of decision do I end up wanting to make? And artificial intelligence hopefully will have a significantly deflated role. It will probably, majorly be concerned with, the major enduring technical challenges of all the hardware and software we've built. We'll use AI to help us navigate technical systems we've created. It will assist us to understand the technical aspects of things we've created, but not really much else. It's very good at representing what we've already done, but mainly in a form that only makes sense to human beings. It does not have the programmed agency to do much else. And if we ever give it the programmed agency, it will be on the basis of the ultimate delusion that we believe that AI can replace society itself or our need for politics.
Thank you for joining us on this special episode of Radical Priorities. I'm Ben Parkins.
I'm Aidan Clark.
Thank you so much for listening.